All right, welcome back everyone to our second screencast of the year. Really this one out of necessity because I'm not going to see Period 5 and Period 7 tomorrow. So really what we're going to focus on is politics in the colonies. And we're going to kind of take it through different time periods. So we're going to first look at pre-1685, the early colonial period, a very short period but a significant period called the Dominion of New England. And then the period that follows up until the end of the French and Indian War, which is known as the period of salutary neglect. And so it's kind of shifting relationship between Britain and their North American colonies, and how it affects the development of the colonies is really key here, I think. All right, so that first time period that we're looking at, pre-1685, this is when a lot of the major colonies are settled. So we know Virginia, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, all of those New England colonies are settled in this time period. The Chesapeake Bay is settled. The Restoration colonies are created in the Carolinas and New York and Pennsylvania. So you have almost all of the colonies except Georgia are created in this pre-1685 time period. And so what's something that's important here is that, it's something that we've emphasized in class already, politically the colonies are given the chance to develop on their own. And they develop a lot of their own systems for government. They draw on things that they've learned from England as far as a legislature, a bicameral legislature, and some democratic tendencies, but in a lot of ways what they do is very unique. And that's why certain colonies develop differently than other colonies politically. Like New England with the town hall meetings, some of the southern colonies a little bit more differently. Each colony is pretty unique in certain ways, and the reason is because Britain is not taking a hands-on approach in this time period. They're very different from the Spanish. The Spanish take a very hands-on approach to their colonial affairs, and the British really don't. As we mentioned before, as long as they're making the profits from mercantilism and the trading, they really kind of take a hands-off approach to government, at least in this pre-1685 period. And there's a few reasons for why. One, the system is working. Two, they have a lot of issues and a lot of problems going on in England. They're having civil war and conflict, changing of rulers, going from a king to Oliver Cromwell back to a king. And so they're preoccupied in a lot of ways too. And so the colonies are functioning and still creating money. And so for the most part, they're leaving them to run on their own, to run their own systems. Now, as a result of that, the colonists are going to come up with some of their own ideas of representation. So as we know, the British have a form of representation in Parliament, with an upper house and a lower house. And some of the colonial legislatures copy that system. But the colonists' idea of representation is very different from the British, and this is very important to understand because it's going to play a big role in America's ideas and reasons for wanting to revolt in the American Revolution. So we have to understand this difference between actual representation and virtual representation. So the colonists believe in something called actual representation. The British believe in something called virtual representation. The difference is the British kind of believe that, say for example, Parliament. Parliament has all of these different members. Let's say 50 members or 60 members of the Parliament. They collectively represent everybody in England. So technically, according to the British, they also represent the people in America because they represent everyone in the English Empire. The colonists believe in something called actual representation, which means that, yes, if you have a legislature, you have to have somebody come from your region that represents you in that legislature, or comes from your town that represents you in that legislature, in order for you to actually have representation. And this comes directly from the colonists' own experiences. In their colonial legislatures and in their town halls, they have people directly from their neighborhood, from their area, from their town, their county, that represents their interests in their colonial legislature. In England, their members of parliament, it doesn't work like that. All of the members of parliament could come from one area of England, and they collectively represent all of England. That's kind of their understanding of representation. The colonists don't have that understanding of representation. So this is a more technical look at, when you look at what's going to become the American Revolution later on, this argument of no taxation without representation. the British are going to look at this argument and say, well, it doesn't make any sense what the colonists are saying because they do have representation. Everybody is represented by Parliament. Anybody in the English Empire. The colonists are going to say, no, that's not true. We don't have a representative from Massachusetts. We don't have a representative from Virginia, from our particular area, or any of the colonies in general. And so they make the argument that they're not represented. So it's not the fact that it's no taxation without representation. It's the colonists thinking that they don't have representation. The British, on the other hand, would argue, yes, you do have representation. That's kind of like the core of the argument. And this kind of stems from the period, this pre-1685 period, and the colonists' different understanding and different development of democratic ideas and republican ideas within the colonies. And so, with that in mind, when they have these colonial governments, something that's important, even all the different colonies, the proprietary colony of the different types, the charter colony, which is really a corporate colony, or the royal colonies, no matter what, they all eventually develop a legislature, some kind of political legislature for the entire colony. And in every single case, at least one house is elected by the people, and they get actual representation in the colonial legislature. So it's a different idea, a different mentality than back in England. So if you don't know what these different colonies are, proprietary, charter, royal, I would pause it right here and just copy some of this information down. Alright, so things start to change with the colonists when a new king comes into power, James II of England. So there's a lot of things that the colonists don't like about James II. And people in England also don't like him for certain reasons. So number one, he's Catholic, which is a major problem with a lot of the English colonists here in North America, and then also the English subjects back in England. It creates a lot of turmoil. So he comes to power in 1685. So that's one issue that they have with him, that religious issue. The second thing, though, is that he also decides to take a much more hands-on approach to the colonies. So this is called, when he sets up the Dominion of New England, and some more hands-on approaches to the colonies. So what he does is he models his form of colonialism after the Spanish. So what the Spanish did was they kind of did stuff like this. So basically, if you look at the green, that represents this new Dominion of New England. The Spanish kind of set up these things called viceroys, and they were these big areas that were given a governor, one governor, in their colonies, and he controlled basically everything. Everything kind of went through this one governor. He controlled, every aspect of it, and it really kind of had almost like complete authority. He kind of reported back to the king in Spain, but he had a lot of authority there on the ground in the colonies. James II is going to try and do the same thing in the British colonies here. So he kind of combines Connecticut, Massachusetts, parts of New York even, parts of New Hampshire, parts of New Jersey, all into this big Dominion of New England. He gives them one governor, this guy, Sir Edmund Andros. And Sir Edmund Andros kind of gets almost like total authority. And so right away, Andros tries to assert his authority, and he disbands the colonial legislatures. He starts to infringe upon some of the rights that the colonists have become used to getting. And right away, he kind of causes a lot of tension between himself and the colonists, specifically in Massachusetts and New England. And so this is very important to understand because this is kind of like showing you what the colonists are how the colonists are going to react later on, again when the British become more active in the colonies. So in this case, what they're trying to do here, they're going to try and do is subvert Andros's power here. They have a lot of objections to what's going on, simply because they've been used to governing themselves for so long, and now the English want to take this really strict, strong approach to the colonists, and they don't want to. They want to keep their traditions, and so they have a backlash against this. So what actually ends up happening here in the Dominion of New England is that they get so fed up with Andros that they almost kind of have like a mini revolt here. When they take Andros, they capture him, and they put him on a boat and basically tell him he's done and send him back to England. Now, they do all this. Now, what's also going on in England at the same time, and they don't know that it's happening in England, which is important to understand, is that People in England are also overthrowing King James II at the same time. It's known as the Glorious Revolution, and it occurs in 1688 in England. And this time is when they restore a Protestant ruler back to the throne, in King William and Queen Mary. And they come back to the throne and restore Protestantism back to England. So that's going on in England at the same time that they're having their problems with Andros here in Massachusetts and in the New England colonies. They're going to send him back to England. But it's kind of key. So they kind of got a taste of more direct rule here, and they don't like it. And you can kind of see this rebellious streak that kind of comes through New England specifically, but a lot of the colonies, some of the middle colonies as well. And I made a comment to those of you who came to the review session today that if this had lasted a bit longer, you might have seen the American Revolution 100 years earlier. You know, they're not used to this, and they don't like the fact that England's taking a more hands-on approach. So it's only 3 years, but it gives you a little bit of a window into the colonist mindset. They like the fact that they have been given autonomy a lot as far as governing themselves. They're used to it. They're used to their rights. They're used to their legislatures. And when people start to infringe upon it, they react pretty strongly to it. So this is a good snapshot into the colonial mindset. Basically 100 years before the American Revolution takes place. All right, we're going to kind of skip the Salem witch trials, but just know that I think it's interesting to know that the Salem witch trials occur right after the Dominion of New England ends. And so after there's no governor at the time because they haven't kind of reinstituted their systems yet. And so it is kind of occurring in a space of anarchy with the government. So hopefully you've learned a little bit about these witch trials in the past. And if not, I'll just research them a little bit to know what's going on. It's happening in Puritan New England. So it's not surprising, I think, the context and the place where the witch trials occur. Okay, so the last big area, or the last big time period is going to be after the Dominion of New England ends. And so that's 1688. So from 1688 to 1763, and the dates are pretty specific because 1763 is the end of the French and Indian War. So that time period there is really what historians would call the time period of salutary neglect. Even though I would also call the period from 1607 to 1685 salutary neglect as well. Officially, salutary neglect is from 1688 to 1763. So just to review, after James II is gone, William and Mary, who come to the throne in England through the Glorious Revolution, they decide to kind of take the old approach. Use mercantilism, use the Navigation Act, trade with the colonies, try and make profits off of it. They're making money basically throughout this whole time. And so they try to take more of a hands-off approach because they don't want to upset the colonists. The system is working too well. And so they go back to this, to salutary neglect of trading with the colonists, being less active politically, more active economically with the colonists. So one key, and then basically it's kind of like this, they're kind of just leaving them alone. And so the colonists again get used to it. Now your generations are passing where they're used to England not interfering. And then after the French and Indian War, this period right before the American Revolution, when they start to interfere again, and pretty heavily with King George III, and Parliament's getting involved pretty extensively, that's when you're going to really see a lot of friction and a lot of backlash from the American colonists. So the last big thing here that I do want to talk about is an important trial that takes place in colonial America. And it's going to kind of lead to some of our other rights that Americans deem important. So this is the trial of John Peter Zenger. It takes place in Pennsylvania. And the thing here is he's tried for something called libel. And libel is when you write something that is untrue about, say, a politician or basically any political figure, any person in a newspaper, and you print that. So he's being tried here for this crime of libel. And so this kind of brings up this whole idea of freedom of speech in the colonies and freedom of the press. And it becomes important here to understand the fact that it's going to become a tradition in the colonies, and it starts here with this trial in 1735 of the fact that, you know, you do have certain rights that are protected, and one of them is freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And you're going to see these things end up in important American documents.